I'm Nancy. I'm with Ozark Mountain Publishing, and we're the sponsors for the conference. So I'm hoping everybody enjoys their weekend and everything goes great once I get off stage. I want to take this moment real quick just to thank everybody who has been involved with making this happen. As our staff, our volunteers, our AV crew, KGRA, UFO Hub, and everybody here. Oh, I sound like I'm crying. Everybody here at the Best Western. And a huge, huge thank you to Forrest, come here, Forrest Crawford, who is our MC. And at this time, we want to turn it over to Forrest.
You did great. You did great.
Thank you.
Everybody give Nancy a great big hand. That was the equivalent of having a bucket of spiders dumped on her head, okay? All right, welcome everybody. Quick show of hands. How many of you are at this conference for the very, very first time? Oh my God, that's fantastic. That is fantastic. Okay, another show of hands. How many of you, this is your very, very first UFO conference ever? Oh, this is good. This is good. Now, we've had this conference going for a lifetime, and for many, many years, it was literally like the same 300 people would come back every year, and then we'd have like an extra 100 or two that would drift in and out, which is also fantastic. This is even way better to have so many new people. Welcome to everybody, and I hope you enjoy the conference and have a good experience. Now, let's get kicked off today with a fantastic speaker, all right? Our first speaker worked for the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense, investigating UFOs and other mysteries officially for the British government, leading the media to nickname him the real Fox Mulder. Okay. You didn't have a cute red-headed sidekick, though, I'm sorry. Because of his work on these real X-Files, he has worked as consultant and spokesperson on numerous alien-themed movies, TV shows, and even video games. He's a regular contributor to various TV documentaries and news shows, including Ancient Aliens, Tucker Carlson's show, and he has written 2 science fiction novels and 3 non-fiction best-selling UFO books. His most recent book is a thriller called Blood Brothers, and his most recent DVD is a documentary called Aliens at the Pentagon. Now, I love the title of his speech. It's called Disclosure or just a tip of the iceberg. Okay, if you didn't get that, you will by the time he's done, okay? It's a brilliant title, trust me. If you remember back in 2017, the New York Times broke a story of how the Pentagon had been running a secret UFO program that was called AATIP, which had investigated UFOs. This bombshell revelation and the associated release of declassified military videos of gun camera footage showing U.S. Navy pilots chasing UFOs made headlines all around the world. Many in the UFO community saw this as disclosure. This is a big word we use. While others linked it with President Trump's aspirations to create a space force. Are we really in a disclosure endgame, or are there other explanations? Having run a similar program for the UK, our first speaker today will share his views on current developments and give an insider's insight into what's really going on. Join me in welcoming Nick Pope.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Forrest, for that introduction. Forrest promised you a great first speaker, but I'm afraid you'll have to do with me. I'd like, first of all, to thank everyone involved with the Ozark Mountain UFO Conference. Nancy, Brandy, the AV team who have helped me, being the least technically adept person in the history of the world, and whose assistance I may have to call on at the end to play a couple of videos. And also, I would like to pay tribute to 2 absolute giants, sadly no longer with us, but without whom we would not be here today, Lou Farish and Dolores Cannon. Gone but not forgotten, and we honor their legacy by being here today and sharing information and making connections and making friends. So, I am going to get straight into it. As Forrest said in his introduction, I worked for the British government for 21 years at the Ministry of Defence. I was a civilian employee working alongside military colleagues, and the British Ministry of Defence is essentially the UK's version of your Department of Defence. And the Ministry of Defence serves both as a policy-making Department of State. The Ministry of Defence serves both as a policy-making Department of State, but it also doubles up as the UK's highest level military headquarters. And we Brits spell defence with a C. One time when I first put my website up, somebody made a comment and said, this guy must be a complete imposter. He can't even spell the organization where he claims to have worked. And then somebody posted underneath, dude, Brits spell defense with a C. While I served for 21 years at the Ministry of Defense, I served in a number of different capacities. They move you around every 2 or 3 years on either level, transfer, or hopefully promotion. And over the course of my 21 years, I did a number of different jobs. And I was involved in a bit of everything, really, which was the idea. Briefing, which was most of what I did, involved briefing senior military officers, senior civilian officers, and of course the politicians, the Secretary of State for Defense, and the other undersecretaries. But I also had a job where I was involved with personnel policy. I had a job that involved finance. I had a job which, in fact, my final tour of duty was as an acting deputy director in the Directorate of Defense Security. I'm going to say that again, acting deputy director in the Directorate of Defense Security. Or, as we used to say, an AD in DDEFSI. My father was a senior Ministry of Defense official too, and one time my stepmom banned the two of us from using any MOD acronyms at the dinner table. She said it was just impossible to keep up with everything. Who's that handsome devil? For much of the early 90s, I was posted to a division where I ran the MOD's UFO program. And this is one of only 2 photographs that exist of me actually in the office in front of the real life X-Files, as they are called. There we are. And the reason there are so few photos, obviously, there are very strict controls over taking photos or videos in any Ministry of Defense building. So this had to be done with official permission. And the branch security officer even had to come round and check that not only were there no classified papers on display, but that you couldn't zoom in on anything. My job was to research and investigate the UFO phenomenon and to come to a judgment, an assessment of whether anything reported to us constituted a potential threat, an actual threat or a potential threat to the defense of the United Kingdom, or whether any of these sightings suggested anything of more general defense or scientific interest. And we got about 200 or 300 UFO reports each year. The investigative methodology was fairly simple and straightforward and standard. You would interview the witness, you would get the details of the story, and then you would run a series of checks. We obviously knew at any given time what we had flying, civilian, military, weather balloon launches, airships. We also had access to astronomical data from the Royal Greenwich Observatory. We had basically a full picture of anything going on in our skies. So when we got the UFO reports, we would cross-check with that. And we would, obviously, a big part of UFO investigation is to look at the radar data to see whether visual sightings can be corroborated by radar evidence. And a final part was that if we had photos or videos, obviously we had access to intelligence community imagery analysis resources and capabilities which could be brought to bear on this, and which could tell us, firstly, whether something was genuine or whether it had been faked. And secondly, if it hadn't been faked, we could, particularly if we had not just something in the sky, but the ground or trees, then you can start triangulating and making some sort of calculations about the distance that the object is from the camera lens, therefore its size, and without getting into too many technical details, but the shape of an object can tell you things about aerodynamics, energy sources, propulsion system, etc., etc. And most of the cases that we got came from the public. We were a public program. We weren't secret. We were in the phone book, literally. Well, almost literally. You could write to me. You could phone me up. We were like Project Blue Book. And we had to be. Most of the sightings that we investigated came from the public. And although we probably paid a little bit more attention, and the Secretary of State for Defense and senior military officers were more interested where UFOs were being seen by pilots, tracked by our own radar operators, witnessed by military personnel or police officers. But I felt that it was, not only was it patronizing, but it was bad science to cut out the public, because in terms of volume, most sightings came from the public. So we looked at everyone and everything. And at the end of all of that, we found that most of these sightings could be explained in conventional terms, but some couldn't. 80% were misidentifications: aircraft lights, weather balloons, meteors, satellites, etc. In 15% of cases, there was probably insufficient data to make a firm assessment. And in 5% of the cases, around about 5%, unknown. Now, it's important to stress, unknown does not automatically mean we think it's alien. But neither did we rule out that possibility. And if you went on to the Ministry of Defense website back when the program was running, and I'll get into that in a little while, you would find statements where we said things like, we take no position on the existence of extraterrestrial life and remain open-minded about the possibilities. And I'm sure we'll get into a little of that. Now, you might think, well, surely something isn't it easy to tell? If something's a weather balloon, that's easy. If something's an airship, that's easy. Not necessarily, not these days, particularly. Here's a lot of people, when I first showed this slide, I put it up. I used to put this up as a quiz question. And I used to say, what sci-fi movie does it come from? And people were like, oh, Independence Day, War of the Worlds. Well, it's not from any science fiction movie. This is a real unmanned aerial vehicle. It's called Tyrannus. And for those of you who know your Celtic mythology, it's the Celtic god of thunder. And this is British. Hurrah! Us Brits are still in the game, you know, we can still build things. But doesn't it look, for all the world, like the archetypal sci-fi meme of the spaceship in a hangar? And I can tell you, this is a promotion. This is not secret. I'm not a whistleblower. This is an unclassified presentation. I'm only able to speak about these matters because the Ministry of Defense itself has declassified and released most of its UFO files. And the things that I'm going to talk about in relation to the Pentagon's program have been officially confirmed by the Pentagon, by their Office of Corporate Communications, their Freedom of Information sections. But just to show you how difficult UFO research and investigation can be these days, this is the sort of thing that we are building. This will fly halfway around the world with no human pilot in it, and it will unleash hell on the bad guys. This is the sort of thing that we are building. This, as I say, this photo is a promotional still that was posted, and I think still is posted, on the UK Ministry of Defence website, and also the website of BAE Systems, the defence corporation that actually built it. But if you saw something like that when you were going home this evening, I could forgive you for saying, my goodness, I think I've seen a UFO. And here's the thing. Aviation technology generally runs, depending on which aviation journalist you ask, and 10, 15, 20, maybe more years ahead of anything publicly declared. So if this is the stuff that they're putting on the Ministry of Defense website, what have they got now that they're not going to tell you about for the next 20 years? And how do we factor that into UFO investigation? It's tricky. When we were doing this in government, we had a pretty good idea of what we had, what the Russians had, what the Chinese had. But having said that, even those of us with high security clearances working on the UFO program did not necessarily have read-on access to every specific deep black project going on in the secret corridors of power. So yes, somebody might have come up to us from time to time and tapped us on the shoulder and said, don't worry about that one, that was one of ours. But I put this up for a reason, just to show you. And I'm going to answer my question, what might they have that they're not telling you about, or at least that's not flying. This has been built, it's flown. And this is slightly off topic, but it's been in the news recently. The UK and the US, I believe, have recently reaffirmed that for the foreseeable future, as a matter of US and UK government policy, there is always going to be a human being in the decision-making process when it comes to targeting. In other words, even though that can fly halfway around the world and kind of be on station and then drop bombs or missiles with extreme precision, the power to take that targeting decision is not going to be handed over to AI and computer algorithms and things. And for those of you that think that sometimes life imitates art, art imitates life, the UK has an integrated communications system, satellites, battlefield comms, all tied together. And we called it Skynet, which for those of you who know your sci-fi and your Terminator franchise was probably, well, maybe a little warning to us. But for the foreseeable future, certainly the UK and the US government are not going to let the machines make the decisions. But other countries and non-state actors, of course, are not necessarily going to be constrained by those legal, moral, ethical constraints. Well, that's a whole different presentation. FCAV, Future Combat Air Vehicle. This is the answer to the question, what's next? If Tyrannus is old technology, what's next? Well, this is probably next. This is an Anglo-French collaborative effort. And again, something like that, the idea is that it flies all the way around the world, just stays where you want it to stay, can monitor things with extreme precision, and then unleash hell. Sorry, this is very warlike, isn't it, for a new agey kind of... Well, you know, it is what it is. I'm just kind of trying to contextualize some of this. So, again, it looks like it comes from the Star Trek or the Star Wars franchise. This one is, of course, an artist's impression. But again, it's an artist's impression taken from the Ministry of Defense website. And again, it poses the question, if this is the stuff they're telling you, what aren't they telling you? And this is the UK's best-known UFO incident, the Rendlesham Forest case. I don't have time to get into that. I mean, it is an entire presentation in its own right. But just to show you, that sketch was made by one of the witnesses, Jim Penniston, back in December 1980 in Rendlesham Forest in the UK, adjacent to the twin United States Air Force bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge. And Jim Penniston, along with John Burroughs and a number of other witnesses, saw a UFO over a series of 3 nights. And on the first night, it actually landed. And but just to show you, it's interesting to contrast. You know, it's not a million miles away from something like that. So, with all of these UFO cases, we're always asking ourselves, is this from somewhere else, or is it from here? And on one occasion, we actually had, I think this was the topic of my presentation the last time I came here to the Ozark Mountain UFO conference. And I think I was here back in 2016, and I believe my presentation then was about this case called the Calvine incident from August of 1990 in the UK. This is an artist's recreation of a poster-sized, blown-up copy of a photo that was on my office wall for years before my skeptical head of division convinced himself that this could only be some secret prototype, hypersonic, probably US aircraft. So he took it down. Now, as I say, this was done from Declassified. I went to LA, teamed up with a graphic artist, and using the Ministry of Defense declassified UFO files, where there was a very poor image of a line drawing that somebody in the Defense Intelligence staff had done of the actual photo. But putting all this together and using my memory, we reconstructed this image. And it's as near as we can get to the actual photo, which was mysteriously lost. the Ministry of Defense declassified and released its UFO files. That's a process that started in 2007. The Ministry of Defense, for years, had a policy of downplaying the true extent of its interest and involvement in this phenomenon to the British Parliament, the media, and the public. And then when we started declassifying and releasing the files, there was a little bit of a day of reckoning, because we'd always said, oh, this subject isn't really of any defense significance. We glance at these reports to see if there's anything of any interest, but we don't think there is. It turns out, so far, we have declassified and released on this subject that's of no particular interest 60,000 pages of documents. Let me tell you, you don't have 60,000 pages of documents on a subject that is of no defense interest or significance. So one time I went to a briefing. Actually, it was for my boss to try and get him a little bit more on side. And the briefer was one of my colleagues in the Defense Intelligence staff, and he too had this exact same picture. And he brought it out of the folder, showed my boss, and he said, "See that picture?" He said, "Well, we know." He said, "It's not the US, it's not the Soviets, and that only leaves..." And my boss looked, and he looked up, and he said, "Right." And we were walking back to the office, and my boss said, "Interesting brief." I said, "Yeah, boss." And he said, "When he said that only leaves, did he mean the Chinese?" And I'm, no, boss, he did not mean the Chinese. Okay, let's get to a few things. Project Blue Book, the real one, not the History Channel series, though I recommend it. You know, it's not a documentary, so don't get too upset that it goes off into these wildly entertaining flights of fancy. It's if you want a documentary, there are plenty of documentaries out there. So I know a couple of people are a little upset with History Channel, and you know, I would say no, just treat it as fiction, loosely based on fact. But there was, of course, a real Project Blue Book, and in many ways, it was the US equivalent of the job I did at the Ministry of Defense. It was a publicly acknowledged UFO program. It ran from 1947 through to 1969. It ran under 3 different names, actually. Project Sign, Project Grudge, and Project Blue Book. It was essentially the same thing, though. Research and investigate the phenomenon and assess whether there's any threat to defense and national security. So pretty much exactly what I did for the British government. Project Blue Book was terminated in 1969, and the US government said at the time, "We've looked at this now for over 20 years. In all that time, we are not convinced that there's anything here of any potential threat or anything that we think is scientifically beneficial, so we are cancelling the project." And a lot of people said, "I don't believe it. You know, it's probably just gone underground." And of course, for years, the US government, when asked, said, and in fact, I will show you exactly what they said, because you could go on to, a lot of people search the web, of course, for, what does CIA know about UFOs, or FBI, or NSA, NASA, DOD, and all of these agencies, somewhere, they have UFO documents, but somewhere they had a statement very much like this. This one was taken from the DOD website. Now removed, I believe, and you'll see why. This issue is no longer being investigated by the Defense Department. Except, oops, they had a program. And as Forrest mentioned in his intro, and as many, many of you, I'm sure, will be aware, but that for those that haven't seen it, in December 2017, front page of the New York Times, it was acknowledged that the US government had run a program called AATIP. And AATIP looked at UFOs, among other things. We'll get into the details of exactly what they looked at in a little while. So, how many of you here have ever taken flack from family, friends, work colleagues? How many have ever, anyone ever said to you something like, oh, you don't believe that crazy stuff, do you? No, 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 the government doesn't really look at these things. Anyone? Yes, I'm sure. Before December 2017, if you had challenged that statement, if you'd said, you know, I don't believe the government when they say they don't research and investigate UFOs, they must be doing it. They must know more about this than they're letting on. There must be something out there. Well, I expect many of you have family, friends, work colleagues who kind of ridiculed that idea and probably portrayed you maybe even as those crazy conspiracy people who think the government has a secret program. Well, now, guess what? You weren't the people who believed these crazy conspiracies. You were the people who were right. You were right. The government did have a program, and December 16th, 2017 was the day that it was on the front page of the New York Times, rapidly followed by the Washington Post, Politico, Fox, CNN, NBC, ABC, the BBC, everyone. This was a big story, and rightly so. This is a subject, a story, which I think did more to bring this topic of UFOs out of the fringe and into the mainstream where it belongs than almost any other story that I've come across in recent years. And we are going to do a little bit of a deep dive into some of the things. But first of all, what does AATIP actually stand for? Well, depends who you ask. There are at least 4 different versions out there. Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, Advanced Aerospace Threat and Identification Program, and a suspicion that it either was a spin-off from or is essentially the same thing as a different program called Advanced Aerospace Weapon System Application Program, or OSAP for short. Need a drink of water with all these acronyms. When you can't even be sure what a program is called, you know you're dealing with some fairly shadowy government stuff. And for those of you who say, well, there isn't much difference, for example, between 2 and 4 there, just a little and. Sometimes, I don't know how many of you make Freedom of Information Act requests, but if you do, wording is very important. So if you ask for all documents relating to the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program and you get a nil records response, it's like, oh, you should have said and identification program. So these words are important. But running through certainly the first three, there is a common theme, and that common theme is a threat. And that goes back to the whole rationale, the whole reason why the US, the UK, other nations around the world have UFO programs. We are all worried. Is it the other side? Have they made some quantum leap in aircraft, drones, missiles, whatever? Or is it someone else? And in which case, what are we dealing with? And how could we ever define it? Well, oddly enough, in the military and in government and in business as well, though in a different context, there is actually, I know this is kind of slightly obscure, but there is an equation that defines whether there's a threat or not. And threat is a function of capability and intent. Just as in business, in risk analysis, risk is a function of probability and harm. So, in the military and in government, with many things, we look at threat assessment through the lens of capability and intent. So, for example, when we in the UK are doing a threat assessment, we might say, just slightly off the wall, but France has nuclear weapons. Therefore, that is a capability. But they don't intend to attack us. Not unless Brexit really goes like bad. But so there is a capability, but there is no intent. Therefore, there is no threat. With other nations and non-state actors, you might say there's a take a terror group. There is absolutely an intent, but very often what keeps the threat down is the lack of capability. Then we get into asymmetric warfare, but that's another story. So this is the lens through which government looks at UFOs. And I guess what I'm trying to do in this presentation, and I know a lot of people are going to be presenting some really fascinating stuff in the next couple of days. I think because I've got this opening slot, what I'm attempting to do here is sometimes the government in all of this is portrayed as the bad guy, and that may or may not be the case. But I'm trying to contextualize this in terms of this is how government actually views the UFO phenomenon. This is why government looks at this in the first place. This is how government looks at this, and sometimes this is what we conclude. And one of the other things that we in the Ministry of Defense used to say about UFOs is that in many ways it was the ultimate low probability, high impact scenario. In other words, even if you are hugely skeptical that any of this is extraterrestrial, if you're wrong about that, and if it is extraterrestrial, the implications are so staggeringly, game-changingly huge that you have to be in the game. And that, again, is why government does this. Low probability, high impact. If any of this, if a single case turns out to be the real thing, we rewrite the history books. So let's get into a little bit about AATIP. One of the key players in setting up AATIP was the then Senate Majority Leader, Harry Reid. And Harry Reid had a long-standing interest in this, and he spoke about this to John Glenn, the astronaut. And around about 2006, 2007, Harry Reid was having discussions with John Glenn and others, and John Glenn was saying, you know, it is frustrating that astronauts, pilots, radar operators, military personnel are seeing UFOs, chasing them sometimes in jets, tracking them on radar, performing extraordinary speeds and maneuvers, and yet there's a difficulty getting those reports into the system and getting anyone to take it seriously. We need a program. We need somewhere where these people can go and report without fear of adverse career consequences, without fear of being ridiculed or disbelieved. We need to get the data from these people, research, investigate, and then maybe we can answer some of these questions about the phenomenon. What is it? Is there a threat? Is there an opportunity? Governments look at everything in terms of threats and opportunities. And the opportunity when it comes to UFOs is, without a shadow of doubt, technology acquisition. The nation on Earth that first acquires extraterrestrial technology and figures it out, if that's what we're dealing with, is going to be the dominant force on this planet for the foreseeable future, militarily, politically, economically, socially. Those are high stakes. So when people say, why do governments study this and why do they keep it secret? Well, to stop the Russians or the Chinese getting there first, or somebody else. We may not like it, but at the moment, that's the world we live in, and this is how it goes down. So Harry Reid got together with a couple of other senators, Ted Stevens and Daniel Inouye, and they set up this program, AATIP. And one of the interesting things about AATIP was that it largely went into the private sector. Again, that surprised a lot of people. Didn't surprise me. I've seen people in the private sector, in the big defense corporations. Firstly, a lot of them just come from government anyway. They, particularly at senior level on the boards of these companies, the CEOs and people, they come out of senior Air Force and other military jobs, and they walk straight into these big corporations, whichever corporation it is. And the other thing is, government itself doesn't, for example, go and you don't sit in an office in the Pentagon and build an F-35. It's your private sector expertise that go and deliver what you in government as policymakers say we want. So it is with some of these highly classified programs. They go out to people who have staggeringly high security clearances, have probably, as I say, come from government and military, often themselves. And in the case of AATIP, the contract went to Robert Bigelow, Bigelow Aerospace. Robert Bigelow, a long-standing interest in UFOs dating back to a childhood encounter, a passionate believer. Anyone seen his interview on 60 Minutes? If you haven't, go look it up, and you will see somebody who is passionate about this subject and very bullish about what he believes. The interviewer asked, so you really think there's life out there, there's extraterrestrials? And he said, right down here, under our noses. And the interviewer said, you believe that? And he said, I know it. I know this to be true. And the interviewer said, don't you worry that people will think you're crazy? And he said, I don't care. How did he know that it was true? Could it be that his exposure to the AATIP program as one of the prime contractors had given him answers to that question? And even though people in government, like myself, who have been exposed to some of this information are constrained by our secrecy oaths, and I take mine very seriously, non-disclosure agreements and such like, sometimes people will find a way of telling you things, and sometimes it's kind of easy. For me, for example, as I say, the British government is declassifying and releasing the files on which I worked and many of the documents that I wrote. So you can go to the National Archives and see them. And people like John Greenwald, who runs the Black Vault website, has them online, freely available. British government UFO files, many of which were highly classified, secret UK eyes only, for example. So a lot of the reports were fairly low level. I mean, obviously, if somebody writes in and says, I was walking my dog and I saw a UFO, you can't classify that. But all the internal policy papers, those, of course, you can classify. So you can see all of that, and it's very important with this subject, I think. There are a lot of claims made in this field. Very often you will watch a TV show or go to a conference and you'll hear something and you'll say, but how do I know that? Can I check that? With the material that I talk about, for example, with the Ministry of Defense UFO files, yes, you can. You can go to the National Archives website or to John Greenwald's Black Vault website, and all those files that I worked on can be downloaded and read. As I say, 60,000 pages. There's a lot to get through. It is perhaps the classic case of the best place to hide a book is in a library. There is some good stuff in there, but you have to look for it. So we find ways. For me, it's easy. As I say, the British government is itself declassifying. Other people, like Robert Bigelow, maybe find other ways to tell us what's going on. If you look at Bigelow Aerospace, this is one of their logos. Ever think someone's trying to tell you something? You may have a government contract. You may have a non-disclosure agreement. But hell, I can do a logo. One of the most interesting people to come on the scene recently is a career intelligence officer called Luis Elizondo. Started off in the US Army, discovered, and his bosses discovered, that he had an aptitude for intelligence work. He was the guy who actually ran AATIP, and he ran it out of, he was in the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, so an agency of the Department of Defense. Like all good intelligence officers, he doesn't look like one. You know, I guess he wore a suit in the Pentagon. But Lou is very much somebody who has been the public face of this. When the New York Times ran their story about the existence of AATIP, Luis Elizondo was one of their on-the-record sources. And of course, the New York Times was never going to run a story about this without doing a formidable fact check. So not only did they speak to Luis Elizondo, who ran the AATIP program, they spoke, of course, to Harry Reid, who kind of said, okay, you got me, the cat's out of the bag, yes, there was a program. And he tweeted, again, on on December 16th, 2017, when the story came out, Harry Reid, who had set up AATIP, tweeted, "The truth is out there." So again, he's been fairly cautious in some of his statements, but again, I think with some of this you have to read between the lines. The other person who has been very vocal about this, if you'll excuse the pun, is the former Blink-182 frontman Tom DeLonge. And when people say, who would you think would be somebody who would be prominently involved in a campaign to publicize what the US government knows and has been doing about UFOs and to kickstart a conversation with the American people about this subject? If we went back a few years, I suspect that if we'd asked the question, who do you think would be a good front person for that? You would not have said, oh, that guy that was in that punk band. You would have probably said, well, I don't know, maybe a retired CIA director or someone like that, maybe a respected scientist like Michio Kaku. But you probably wouldn't have expected Tom DeLonge to step up to the plate, but he did. And he is now working with Luis Elizondo and with some of the other people who have been involved in AATIP when AATIP was in government. It was a government requirement contracted out to the private sector, but it was a government program. Some of the people who had involvement with that, people like Hal Puthoff, then other people who were involved in this subject like Chris Mellon, Jim Semivan, a number of other people, are now taking forward this initiative, but in the context of a non-public, a public benefit corporation, the To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is Tom DeLonge's organization. And so now you get all these people who were involved with this UFO program, but you get them now in Tom DeLonge's group, and they have an upcoming series which is going to premiere on History Channel in May. So you're going to be seeing a lot more of Lou Elizondo. A big part of, I want to now sort of break down, obviously we know now that the US government had this program, AATIP, and when I mentioned the New York Times fact-checking, what I should have mentioned is that the very final and in a way the most important part of the fact-check is that after the New York Times had seen the documents, for example, the contractual solicitation documents, some of which have now been released, after they'd spoken to people like Luis Elizondo and Harry Reid to confirm that the program was real and that they were the people involved with it, after the New York Times had written everything up, of course, the icing on the cake, they had to get the government to actually say, well, is this true or not? So they put this to the Pentagon through the Office of Public Affairs, and through gritted teeth, very reluctantly, but yes, finally the Pentagon did admit, a spokesperson admitted, yes, we had a program. And it looked at, well, we'll get into that. It looked at far-term aviation threats and some anomalous events. And let's get into that wording and the what did they do. A big part of the New York Times story and the subsequent media coverage were 3 declassified US Navy videos of F-18 Super Hornets chasing UFOs. The images were taken through the FLIR, the forward-looking infrared camera, and I'm sure many of you have seen these stills. The films are all over the internet. They've been given kind of colloquial nicknames like Go Fast and Gimbal and Tic Tac. And again, as part of the New York Times story, and not just the Times, but the Post, Politico, etc., not only did they speak to Harry Reid, who set up the program, Luis Elizondo, who ran the program, but they spoke to some of the pilots who'd actually been involved in some of these chases. Again, all this information is now out there in the public domain. This has all been publicly acknowledged, and one of the pilots, David Fravor, was interviewed as part of this story, and he had a marvelous quote. I mean, these things were tracked on radar, performing extraordinary speeds and maneuvers. I mean, the F-18 Super Hornet is not exactly a kind of, slow piece of tech, and yet these UFOs, whatever they were, absolutely ran rings around them. For those of you who've not seen these videos, afterwards, when you get back to your hotel room this evening, go and watch these on YouTube. Just put in U.S. Navy jets chase UFOs, Gimbal, Tic Tac, and listen to the pilots. I think they've actually had to bleep out some of the language as they're chasing these things. It's like, look at these things go. When fast jet pilots who see things traveling at high Mach speed every day and fly them, for goodness sake, get overexcited and start saying things like that, you can bet yourself that you're dealing with some pretty interesting tech. And David Fravor, one of those pilots, was interviewed, and he came up with this marvelous phrase. He said, "I don't know what the heck it was, but I sure as hell want to fly one." And who can blame him? But yeah, definitely go watch those videos. 3 of them are in the public domain. In interviews that they've given, people like Luis Elizondo have said, we have, in the Pentagon, a whole lot more of those videos, and if you think the quality of the ones you've seen is good, you ain't seen nothing yet. What Luis Elizondo won't do, firstly because he is a loyal and principled person, but secondly because he would likely be arrested and thrown in jail, is he's not going to start talking about information which is still classified. He walks a line, and he knows where that line is, and he knows what the consequences would be if he crosses that line. And he and I have met, and we've had this conversation, and we're in a kind of similar position with this, and we take a similar view. But although he will not break his secrecy oath, and rightly so, and won't, because people say, and this is particularly topical, of course, with the arrest of Julian Assange recently, people say, well, don't the American people have a right to know? And that's not quite the point, because the point is, when you put that information out there, of course, it goes not just to the American people, but to the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, ISIS, etc. So, for people who say, oh, let's just dump the information out there, well, it's not quite that simple. So Luis Elizondo and other people involved in the AATIP program have said, look, I'm happy to talk about material that has been declassified, but it is up to the Pentagon to declassify and release further videos and documents, and he said, I would encourage them to do that. And I would encourage, it was Lou who said he wants the American people to have a conversation about this. Let's take this subject out of the shadows and put it where it belongs, in the spotlight. This is no longer crazy conspiracy theory stuff. For anyone that, when you get back from this event, if anyone says to you, oh, that's just crazy conspiracy theory stuff, please do remind them, no, this was on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, all the major news networks, and this is verifiable information. This is not somebody telling a wild story. This is somebody telling a wild story confirmed by the government, backed up by the documents and the videos. So if anyone gives you a hard time about going to a UFO conference, you tell them, the government's been researching and investigating this too, and we can now prove it. This is no longer speculation. So there are more videos to come, and they will be better and clearer and perhaps more definitive in terms of what we are dealing with than the 3 videos that have been released to date. So I'm giving you this story at a fixed point in time. I'm just giving you a snapshot. But this story, make no mistake about it, is evolving. And in a minute, I'll share with you something that literally happened in the last week on this story. So, and who knows, when we get back this evening, there may be a further development in this story. It is still unfolding. So one aspect of AATIP's work was the metamaterials. Pardon me, the videos, the Navy jets chasing the UFOs. The next angle of this was the metamaterial controversy. And I don't have a huge amount of time to go into this part of the story in great detail, but if you go back to the original stories that appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post, you will see reference to Bigelow Aerospace, remember that logo, modifying buildings so as to store so-called metamaterials which are believed to be associated with the phenomenon. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean, as some people have speculated, wreckage from some crash, maybe Roswell? Or does it mean samples that people have acquired over the years and said, this, I believe, was associated with a UFO event, maybe even an abduction? And I'll get into that aspect of things very briefly in a minute. Now, there are, of course, I've seen the phrase, and it's not a helpful phrase, I've seen the phrase mystery metals used about this. There are no, for the chemists among you, there are no mystery metals. Everything sits somewhere on the periodic table. But what there are metamaterials, so elements or compounds, but constructed in unusual ways. And there are ways of telling. If something is truly exotic, there are ways of telling. I mean, look, if you go and buy a meteorite, if you go to a gem show, you buy a meteorite, you have to know, there has to be a way of telling that you haven't just paid like several $100s for a rock that someone picked out of their backyard. Hey, I bought a rock, great. Well, there is a way, and it's called isotopic ratio analysis. In other words, if something comes from space, a meteorite I'm talking about, its elements will be in a different isotopic ratio because of exposure to cosmic rays, which on Earth we are protected from. So you can tell. And the story about these so-called metamaterials associated with the AATIP program is that, yes, apparently they have been subjected to isotopic ratio analysis, and the conclusion was that they are not from here. So watch this space. This more Navy jet videos to come, more revelations, I think, on the meta materials to come. There is still controversy and debate about, despite all of this, there's still a debate raging about what exactly AATIP was. But I just want to, we have very, very little paperwork about AATIP, but I want to show you in the next slide some quotes taken from one of there are literally only about 3 or 4 documents relating to AATIP that have yet been declassified. All of them are important, staggeringly so. Few of those documents are as important as Harry Reid's June 24th, 2009 letter to the Deputy Defense Secretary at the DoD, where he set out some information. And Harry Reid has confirmed, former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid has confirmed, yes, this is the letter that I wrote to the Deputy Defense Secretary, Lynn Buchanan III. That letter has been published. It's on the internet. George Knapp published it, and a British newspaper called Metro published it, and it's doubtless on a zillion UFO sites, but it's probably one of the single most important declassified documents you will ever read about UFOs. And this is what it says about AATIP. And I'm just going to read these verbatim, just in case there are people at the back whose sight, like mine, is not good. This is taken from Harry Reid's letter to the Department of Defense. Associated exotic technologies likely involve extremely sophisticated concepts within the world of quantum mechanics, nuclear science, electromagnetic theory, gravitics, and thermodynamics. And he went on to say that those technologies have the potential to be used with catastrophic effects by adversaries. Remember what I said about the Russians and the Chinese and technology acquisition, and how it's not just a case of let's dump all this information into the public domain because the American people have a right to know. When you do that, everyone gets the information. So, used with catastrophic effects by adversaries. And he finished up by saying, the technological insight and capability gained will provide the US with a distinct advantage over any foreign threats and allow the US to maintain its preeminence as a world leader. Now, that's from Harry Reid's June 24th, 2009 letter. I would urge you to go and read that letter in entirety. But I said that there was a debate going on. Remember what I said about the British government and how our long-standing policy was to downplay the true extent of our interest and involvement in this phenomenon. Well, that, of course, has been the policy here too in the US. And after the media coverage about AATIP, Congress, as you might expect, was kind of a little bit, hey, what the heck's been going on here? Congress, you know, all the Congress people and the staffers read read the New York Times and they saw Harry Reid talking and tweeting about this, and they saw Luis Elizondo, and they'd probably written letters to constituents, maybe people like yourselves, and they'd probably signed their names to statements saying, no, the US government doesn't do this anymore. We shut down Blue Book in '69. I've been assured there isn't a program. We don't do it. And then this story broke, and all the Congress people were like, wait a minute. So, as you would expect, among others, the Senate Armed Services Committee, the House Armed Services Committee, asked some fairly sharp questions and said to the Defense Intelligence Agency and the DOD, what? You told us that there was no program, and now we're reading there's a program. What did these people do? What was AATIP? And a sharp-eyed researcher noticed months and months ago, was going through the congressional record, I think it was April last year, and he noticed in the daily order of business, which ran to about 42 pages, but he noticed a little line where it said, DIA sent the Armed Services Committee a brief on the products produced under the AATIP program. At that point, and one of the things that I now do is I work as a journalist. At that point, I got in touch with the DIA's Office of Corporate Communications, and I said, here we have this congressional record saying the DIA sent Congress a letter about AATIP. Please, can I have that letter? And we had emails going back and forward and back and forward and back and forward for months about it, until on January 16th this year, into my inbox pinged a brief email from a press officer at the DIA's Office of Corporate Comms, and he said, here's the letter. And I just double-checked with him. You know, I said, I am intending to publish this. And he's like, yeah, the only proviso is you don't name the specific press officer. You simply say it comes from the Office of Corporate Communications. But that's exactly the same as in the UK, so I was familiar with that. I said, fair enough. And I tweeted it. And the letter is now out there, and simultaneously a lot of people put in Freedom of Information Act requests, got exactly the same thing. But on January 16th, we finally got our hands on what the DIA told Congress AATIP was. And here's what they said. The purpose of AATIP was to investigate foreign advanced aerospace weapon threats from the present out to the next 40 years. Okay, fair enough. In line with the usual policy of downplaying and camouflaging official interest in UFOs, this sounds like it's got nothing to do with UFOs, right? This sounds like it's an aviation program. Yeah, well, of course you'd be worried about what the Russians or the Chinese are doing. Foreign advanced aerospace weapon threats for the next 40 years. It sounds from that letter that DIA sent to Congress as if DIA were just doing what you would expect them to do. What is aerospace technology going to look like in the next 40 years, and how can the US be ready to meet and mitigate any threats? Well, fair enough. if I put it to you that the clear implication of that statement is that it's nothing to do with UFOs, nothing to do with aliens. If AATIP was indeed an aerospace threat program, you would expect, I would expect, as somebody who's lived in that world, I would expect to see papers on the current and likely future state of Russian aircraft design. I would expect to see papers about Chinese aeronautical engineering and factory capacity. I would expect to see threat assessments relating to the North Korean ballistic missile program. I would expect to see papers on Iranian drone technology. If AATIP was indeed a foreign aerospace threat program, that is what I would expect to see. But wait a minute, oops, there was an attachment to that letter. I suspect a lot of Congress people read that and they're like, okay, fine, yeah, it's just aerospace. But there was an attachment to that letter, and they listed 38 studies that they described as being what was produced under the AATIP program. And these are some of the subjects that they were looking at. This is from the Defense Intelligence Agency to Congress, addressed jointly to the late John McCain, and going to the Senate Armed Services Committee, House Armed Services Committee, Intelligence Committee, Appropriations Committee, and this is what the DIA said. This is what we studied. Anti-gravity, invisibility cloaking, stargates, warp drive, and wormholes. This, I put it to you, is not about Russian aircraft or Chinese missiles or Iranian drones. This is about something else. And if anyone doubts that, the absolute icing on the cake in terms of what they were really thinking about, a lot of these papers, a lot of these 38 papers, only about 5 of them have been published. A lot of them are about super advanced concepts in propulsion. I mean, when I'm talking about propulsion, I'm not talking about just building a faster aeroplane. I'm talking about traveling to the stars, viable interstellar travel. But there was a paper there on the Drake equation. That's the clincher. The Drake equation, for those of you who don't know, was devised by the astronomer Frank Drake as a tool for trying to estimate the number of communicable civilizations in our Milky Way galaxy. If this was about Russian aircraft and Chinese missiles, you would not be, under the AATIP program, looking at the Drake equation, which asks how many civilizations might there be out there. So if anyone wanted proof that this is not just, when they say foreign, ask yourself, how foreign is foreign? Goes back to what you know, it's not the Americans, it's not the Russians, that only leaves. So when you hear in relation to something like AATIP the word foreign, bear in mind they mean a little further afield than Russia or China. One of the most controversial aspects of AATIP, in that list of 38 papers, and you can you can see, like Harry Reid's letter, that letter from Congress, from DIA to Congress, and the attachment with the list of 38 studies, that's been published. Like I say, I tweeted it. Federation of American Scientists have published it. John Greenwald's Black Vault website published it. A lot of media published it. Go read that letter. Read the covering letter, which uses that phrase, far-term aerospace threats, and then read the list of papers that they actually produced, and ask yourselves, isn't there a bit of a disconnect here? One of the papers was just called Field Effects on Biological Tissues. Now, I don't have time to get into a lot of detail about this, but remember I said that literally in the last week a story broke on this, and it broke actually in a British newspaper. It's interesting. The UK media are running some of the best stories on AATIP that you will read. A lot of the US papers, after the initial coverage in the Times and the Post and everywhere, haven't gone back to this subject as much as one might expect or hope. It's actually been some of the British papers that have published some of the biggest revelations on this, and George Knapp, who works out of Las Vegas. But aside from George Knapp and some of the British newspapers, not much else, but you will find that they published Harry Reid's letter that I quoted from. They published this letter and this list of studies. And one of them, as I say, gets into field effects on biological tissue. It stands to reason that Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the scientific consultant to Project Blue Book, once famously said, "We don't study UFOs. We study reports of UFOs." Given that, we can't, unless you literally think, as some do, that we have a spaceship in a hangar somewhere. If they do, they didn't tell me. Unless you think that we do, we can't study the UFOs themselves, but maybe we can look at the metamaterials, maybe we can deduce things from the videos of the Navy jets chasing the UFOs, but maybe, just maybe, we can look at the effects that the UFOs might have on close encounter witnesses. And it's very interesting that in that list of 38 papers showing what AATIP's focus of interest was, in amongst all this exotic propulsion, theoretical physics, stargates, warp drive, wormholes, something that's going to take us to the stars. In amongst all that are these papers on, or this one paper on the human side of this. And literally in the last couple of days, a British newspaper ran a story to say there's a kind of human experimentation, human interface angle to this. And in fact, Harry Reid, in that letter, there is a throwaway line about human interface. And this is very, very controversial. Obviously, after the CIA MKUltra experiments, there are very strict, and rightly so, rules about what you can and can't do in terms of anything that might be termed human experimentation. But there is some evidence to suggest that one strand of AATIP's work was looking at the human interface. Are some of these metamaterials going to turn out to be alleged implants from abductees? I don't know the answer to that question, but watch this space. are some of the other things that AATIP did, which maybe as more documentation is released over the next few months, however this unfolds, maybe we will find out a little bit more about this. Let me just... Yeah, this first quote was from the original New York Times article. Researchers also studied people who said they had experienced physical effects from encounters with the objects and examined them for any physiological changes. The next quote is from a declassified British government intelligence assessment of the UFO phenomenon. The well-reported Rendlesham Forest Bentwaters event is an example where it might be postulated that several observers were probably exposed to UAP radiation for longer than normal UAP sighting periods, and field effects on biological tissues was a quote from Harry Reid's letter. I'm going to see, and I might have to, I'm coming to the end of my time, I'm going to see if I can play this video, and I might require a little bit of assistance with this. If this video can play, what it is it's a brief 2-minute trailer for a documentary that I made on the AATIP program called Aliens at the Pentagon. Would you mind? And then I've got one more, and I'll wind up.
Top secret Pentagon research projects have long been the stuff of conspiracy theories, but some of them are real. They actually happened, and they're worth knowing about. For example, this week, in response to a Freedom of Information Act request, the Defense Intelligence Agency disclosed that it had, in fact, funded research into UFO-related technologies. This would include the invisibility cloak, warp drives, and anti-gravity. The DIA spent $22 million from 2007 to 2005. The program apparently was initiated by then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid of Nevada. Nick Pope is one of the world's experts in this. He wants to investigate UFOs to the British government. He joins us tonight. Nick, thanks for coming on. It does sound like the core assumption of this research was that UFOs are real.
Yes, it really does. This is something of a bombshell, I think. For months, the Defense Intelligence Agency and the DoD have been trying to spin this story as, well, it's just about advanced aerospace weapons threats. But now we have this document which shows quite clearly what they were looking into. And it's nothing to do with airplanes. It's as you say, anti-gravity, invisibility, cloaking, wormholes, and warp drive. Some of this is about space travel.
These ideas are derived from objects that the U.S. government observed in space, presumably?
Well, we still don't know much of the story. We really only have a handful of papers and documents on this. I got this from the DIA's Office of Corporate Communications, and we're still trying to digest what this means. There are 38 papers that they produced under this contract, defense intelligence reference documents, looking at things which, frankly, sound like science fiction, and yet they're not. Our tax dollars have been spent on looking at this. And you know, there's one of these papers which absolutely is critical. It's looking at something called the Drake equation. And the Drake equation is supposed to be a way that astronomers can calculate how many intelligent civilizations there might be in our galaxy. Well, look, if this is not a UFO program, if this is just about Russian and Chinese aircraft, what the heck are they looking at that for?
Why wouldn't the U.S. government just say, I don't think it'd be especially controversial, we believe it's possible that there are other forms of life in the universe and we're looking into it. Why hide that?
Well, I hope that's exactly what they will now say. I think we know that this letter, which I've now acquired and which has been released under the Freedom of Information Act, we know that this went to Congress. We know that the Armed Services Committee is looking at this very seriously. They're also looking into those videos that we've talked about before of the Navy jets chasing UFOs. So I think the real question is what's going on behind the scenes? And I'm hoping that in the next few weeks, maybe months, Congress is going to say more about this. The Armed Services Committee will speak out, and maybe we'll have public hearings at which all this will be revealed.
So former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, who was for many years in a position to have access to this information for certain, has basically said in public, I know a lot, I think this is real, but he hasn't gone farther than that. Have you spoken to him? Has anyone spoken to him?
I've not spoken to him personally, but I've seen some of his interviews. I've seen his statements. I've seen one of his documents. And for anyone who's trying to say, well, this isn't really about UFOs, it's about next generation aircraft, missiles and drones, no, it isn't. Harry Reid has made it perfectly clear this is about anomalous objects in our airspace, and call them UFOs, whatever you like. You know, we take them seriously. The government has been looking at this.
Why all the lying? That's what piques my interest. It always piques my interest. Nick Pope, thank you for all the work you do on this. The non-crazy, sober, responsible work you do, and I appreciate it.
I guess what I want to kind of conclude on with all this is to say that this story about the Pentagon's UFO program has been now running for over a year. Aliens. It is still unfolding. Almost every week there is a new revelation about this, but you have to look hard for it sometimes. Like I say, we've maybe after the initial media splash with this, things have gone a little bit quiet, but the information is out there, and I would urge you to have a look at it. So, in concluding, I will ask this question. Is this disclosure, or is this part of disclosure? The UFO lobby often use the phrase disclosure, and they put this with a capital D. And if you ask someone what disclosure with a capital D looks like, they usually say, well, it will be the president going on TV, all schedules will be cleared, all the networks will show this, my fellow Americans, people of the world, we are not alone. Having looked at this subject from within government, I very much doubt things will unfold that way. Don't forget, if something like Roswell was real, it's not just my fellow Americans, people of the world, we're not alone. The problem is it's my fellow Americans, people of the world, we're not alone, and we've been lying about it for 70 years. So you can't do that. Nor can it be my fellow Americans, people of the world, there is a phenomenon. It's in our airspace. Our pilots chase them but can't catch them. Our radar operators track them, and they can do things we can't do. And we have no idea what they are, who they are, where they're from, what they're doing, what they want, and the technologies on display are a quantum leap ahead of anything we've got. No government can say that. It's tantamount to saying we've lost control of our airspace. It's tantamount to saying we are no longer at the top of the food chain here. No government can do that. So, you are not going to get, with apologies to people in the UFO community who think otherwise and lobby for it, we are not going to get, my fellow Americans, people of the world, we are not alone. What we might get is exactly what is happening now. Articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post, the subject moving out of the fringe into the mainstream. Intelligence officers who ran programs confirming that it's real. Declassified videos being made available of the phenomenon, whatever it is. So I put it to you in concluding that when people say, when will we get disclosure? My answer is right now, and we're living it. Thank you very much.